Hey guys, LEGO Master 365 here, and welcome back to the Wettham Railway. So it's been a while since I've done like an update on the layout and just kind of like a building the model railway video. That's because I kind of stopped building it and I kind of left it in this unfinished state. So the updates are kind of my way of explaining like the minor changes or the major changes I did to the layout when I wasn't making those kind of videos. The reason I stopped doing that was because I just stopped making the layout. I didn't buy any more materials, I didn't buy Metcalf buildings for the retaining wall and stuff, and now the layout is just kind of in this state of incompletion across all three boards, or all three tables, and it's just slowly just not working right. That's probably down due to the moisture in the basement, because this basement is very much just four walls and a ceiling, well, let's call it four walls and a floor up above, with like no insulation. Well, you can see the insulation, but there's no like paneling and stuff like that. It's a very incomplete basement. It is very much just a hole in the ground for the house to sit on top of. So the layout has been in a moisturized state its entire life. The locomotives haven't. They usually come with me whenever I go back home. But the track is always down here. The everything else is always down here. Only the locomotives come home. Even the rolling stock stays here. Usually during the winter, I'll either take it home or I'll put it in one of the bins that's at the other end of the layout, just so they can kind of like help protect them. But that's also being overrun by spiders, and my arachnophobia will not allow me to open any of those bins anymore. So the layout has kind of stayed in this state, and I don't like it that much anymore. I do love the Heritage Railway feel of it. I do love having two stations to run trains back and forth between, but I don't like that that's all I can do with it. I can only run trains back and forth in between. So I'm going to go through the process of rebuilding this model railway.
So as you can see here, this is the new design for the layout. This is kind of like the track plan for it. You can see there's three separate stations: Wettham Halt, Braddock Station, and Rutherport Harbor. I'll get into those three stations in a bit, but I'm just going to take you through the design of the layout, as you can not really see it in this picture, just the track plan. So the basic design is that it's going to be pretty much two separate layouts combined into one, using some sort of scenery break down the middle of the layout. As you can see by the Wettham side, not the Wettham side, the Braddock side, sorry, there's a tunnel that has like 3/4 of a turn, or like 1/2 of a turn, that goes to the back side and then the front side. Probably the front of that tunnel is going to be like the scenery break that runs all the way down the entire middle section of the layout. The front section is basically the layout as it stands today, which is the Wettham Railway from Wettham Halt to Braddock Station. The back section is going to be a new section that is within the history of the line called Rutherport Harbor, which is where the railway ended up terminating and now reconnects to in preservation. I'm referring to the two halves as the front section and the rear section. The front section is basically what the track is right now. It's just that there's not going to be that choke point at the crossing anymore. It's going to be two completely separate tracks that are isolated from each other, with still some isolated points connecting the two together, so that way trains can go from one track to the other. It also means that then I can control the tracks independently, meaning that I can drive one train back and forth between Wettham and Braddock while still having another train go just around and around in a loop, and I think it's going to make it a lot more fun. The rear section is going to be a harbor that is pretty much just the harbor area. There's going to be a little canal that runs alongside the train tracks that is separated by a pier with the rest of the river that separates the two layouts from each other in like the middle area. It's kind of hard to explain, but basically think of like where the middle of the layout's going to be. One half is going to be grass, and then there's going to be a retaining wall down below that the river runs alongside the other half of the layout. Kind of like, the river is basically the dividing line. It's just more the river's edge is the dividing line between the two halves. That's kind of what I'm going for. The basic idea is that one set from seasons like 3 through 5, like the Arlesburg Harbor sets, that you see sometimes throughout the series. There's that one shot of like from Harold's cockpit of one of the twins with a train. That's kind of the idea I'm going for. So a bunch of buildings and houses in the back, a tiny little port station for the engines to load fish and stuff, and that's the main idea. But with that out of the way, let's take a look at the layout as it stands right now and see what needs to be changed to make the layout new.
So right now, the layout exists as a 2 foot by 15 foot layout. There's plenty of space obviously here to work with, but I just want to make it a little bit bigger and a little bit better, and so I can actually fit a through line, because the 18 radius curves are not going to fit on a 2 foot wide bend. So I'm going to extend the layout to a 4 foot by 16 foot layout that now has a whole curve that is actually going to be 15-inch radius instead of 18-inch, because the 18-inch radius curve is going to be on the outside loop going that way. Right now, the layout exists where the turn is going to the left. I'm going to change it so it goes to the right into a tunnel. Over here, the layout is going to remain mostly the same. We're still going to have the points here, so there's going to be a middle track and then a side track over here for the passengers to get on and get off. The middle line is going to stop still at the station, and then this far track over here is still going to connect to the sheds over here, which is going to be a completely different building, but instead of stopping over there, it's going to continue going through and turn to the left over here. It's a loop, so it's left over here, it's right over there. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do with the back part here. It's probably just going to be a retaining wall or something like that, probably a scenery break. I'm not 100% sure what's going to happen like back here behind the station and stuff like that, but generally this stuff is going to remain the same. This stuff might get pushed a little bit closer inwards, I'm not really sure. The biggest change is going to be here at the choke point, at the base, the joining of the baseboards, or the joining of the tables, I guess, between tables 1 and tables 2. So the reason there's a choke point over here is so that way all the tracks are connected at some point and have power. Right now the layout is on DC power, meaning that I only have one controller being used to drive the trains. As you can see here, Stepney is trying to make his way across. It is just normal for Stepney to not to work. But all the tracks are still connected at one point, so that way all the rails are connected and all the trains can run at the same time. What you might not know is that my controller actually has two knobs, so I can actually run 2 tracks at the same time. So the idea is to get new track. I'm not going to use the Atlas track anymore, I'm probably going to use Pico track, and I'm going to separate the tracks here at the choke point. What I'm going to do with the choke point instead is I'm going to have some passover tracks, or crossover tracks, I don't know what you want to call them, but there's basically just going to be 4 points that connect to each other, and they're all going to be isolated from each other, meaning that the outer track, or I guess that'd be the inner track, so the inner track is on its own controller, probably knob 2, and then the outer track, the one closer to us, is going to be on track 1, like it already is, the one that Stepney's running on. That is going to be track 1. Where's the best place to show it? Here, I guess. So this line here, the middle track and the outside track, is going to be on track 1, and then this line here with the sheds and all that stuff, that's going to be on track 2. Even over here, it does the same thing. It splits right apart again. It's going to be the same thing, but it's just going to be isolated instead, so that way I can run 2 trains at the same time, one bouncing between these 2 stations, and the other going in a full loop, just around and around, so I can just look at something the whole time. Now, over here at Prydock Station, there's going to be huge changes and huge developments. Right now, the layout kind of exists in this section of the layout exists in this very unfinished state. There's just, like, foam cutouts representing the stations right now, nowhere near done. The yards are completely all the track is completely unballasted beyond this point. Literally, beyond this point right here, there's no ballast. There's no table join between these two. It's just completely barren. This is just kind of like an endpoint for the layout. So what's going to happen is we're going to get an actual station built. We're probably going to use the same stuff that I used over there for Wettham. And we're going to completely develop this. Instead of the turns going to the left, we're going to change it so it goes to the right and into a tunnel. Both tracks are going to go into the tunnel, only one is coming out. That's going to be the inner track. I want to add some points so that way trains can still pass over, and there will be a little kickback siding on the outer track. But for right now, that's still up in the air. It all depends on how the points actually go together and how the track goes together. So I don't 100% know if we're even going to have that yet, but I really want to include that and incorporate that just so that way the trains can still switch in between tracks, and still I can get a big long train going through this track and still just going through like a scenery break so you don't see it. Over here, even though these are just sidings, there's supposed to be another engine shed here. This is where we house the bigger engines, or the other engines that don't that aren't used too much or are just the shunter engines, because all the coaches are stored over here, including the old teak coaches. They are stored right on this track here. So we have the diesels over here for shunting, and then we have the H-Class over here for as a spare engine for the bigger trains that probably pull these coaches right here. So this is going to get developed into its own yard, just like Wetham's own yard. So we'll have a coal stave, we'll have fueling points for the diesels, and there will just be a shed in general, so that way the engines aren't completely out in the cold. Other than that, the track is just going to turn, go into the tunnel. This is probably going to stop by the tunnel, and the yard's just going to be bigger and expanded. So Prydock will be the main station, or not really the main station, but it will be the big station on the layout, and then Wetham will be the main station where the engines stay. So you don't have to see all the coaches and stuff and all the wagons and all that kind of stored over here. It's just a general area for things to be kept. And since the trains only run for like 5 minutes at a time, just because of how close the tracks are together, you don't have to stay here for too long, and you can just go back to Wetham where it's nice and pretty. That's the general idea for Prydock. Prydock's going to have this huge overhaul, and just going to look so much better. Now, part of the Wettham Railway that you might not have ever noticed before on the layouts is this dual gauge track right here. So the original idea for the layout was to have this old abandoned dual gauge, narrow gauge, standard gauge, whatever you want to call it, track here to show where the line used to go. There is an old mine that exists up in the hills, which is why the railway was born in the first place. And so there were dual gauge tracks that kind of went to a yard that probably went somewhere up there. The narrow gauge engines were able to come down. As you can see, the tracks came to these points right here. And when the railway became heritage, they kept the point and just added a second standard gauge track, and then left the old line to rust. What's going to happen now is that there's going to be a whole loop for the narrow gauge track, and that's going to now be incorporated into the layout. Instead of it being dual gauge, they are going to be separate tracks. I would like to include a dual gauge section somewhere, just because I think that track looks really cool, but I don't know exactly where that's going to go. For over here, the track is going to run alongside until it reaches the sheds, then pulls alongside into the sheds where there's going to be its own little spot for the engine and for the coaches, and then it's going to go into the station where you can transfer. The dual gauge track, or the narrow gauge track, will then follow alongside the standard gauge offshoot, and then go back over into Rotherport Harbor. Over here, it's going to continue into a loop, but behind a barrier dividing wall, whatever you want to call it, so that way you can't see it in Prydock Station, and then it just quietly zips into the tunnel that the standard gauge tracks go into, and then comes out alongside the standard gauge track. And then we have one big loop, which is a little bit shorter track, that the narrow gauge engines and the standard gauge engines can run alongside with. And I think that's going to be really fun. I can't wait to include narrow gauge into this layout. It's going to be so much fun. There is a lot of fun that's going to be happening with the Wettham Railway, and I can't wait for you guys to see what I have in store for it. But yeah, that is basically the end of the Building the Model Railway series, because the railway is now complete. It has served its purpose. So now we're going to be rebuilding the model railway. And that's going to be a whole new series I'm going to be doing. I'm going to get whole new tables, I'm going to get a bunch of new stuff, and I'm going to make the layout better than I could have done it before. Now that I know really what I'm doing with my modeling, I know I can make this layout 10 times better than it already is. And I can't wait for you guys to see what I have in store for it. But for now, let's have the engine that started it all, Stepney, pull the last train on the layout in this state that you guys will probably see. I'll probably keep running this layout until we, get the table supplies and stuff, and then I can really start actually making the new layout. But this is the last time you guys will probably see this layout in its current state. So, Stepney, let's take us away.